to another episode of Teach Gen Tech. And today we have Roy coming on the show. And I can tell you this is because I thought something finally clicked and it really didn't. And luckily, Roy offered to come hang out. And before I have Roy talk about everything that we're doing, I do want to say that I met Roy from being part of the Open Source Raid Guild, because y'all know that I talk about D&D enough, and that Roy has our new what do we call you? Did you say it? Game
Game,
manager?
yeah, I mean, you can call it Dungeon Master too, but usually if there's not dungeons, it's people call it Game Master.
Like GM makes me think of like general manager.
Well, I mean, that's what they are, right? The Dungeon Master is the general manager, keeping everyone in line and like
Yeah,
setting the
yeah.
rules and making sure everyone does their job.
This is true. This is true. And we're starting a new game when I get back to town, streaming more regularly, called The Expanse. And if nobody has watched the show, it's really cool. And come watch us stream on Sundays. But that's all for another day. Roy, who are you and what are we going to be learning about?
Yeah, so obviously my name's Roy. I work in full stack development. I do React, usually React on the front end. I've been doing Solid. I even have my Solid mug if anyone from Solid team is around and cheering on. And on the back end, I usually do Node. I've been learning Go as well. Um, yeah, so just build web apps with those languages and like the related technology. And as Jen said, big fan of the Expanse and running the Expanse campaign. Not only if you haven't watched the show, I'd also say if you haven't read the books are excellent and they contain even more story than the shows. There's like it's like another 3 seasons kind of deal. So lots and lots of stuff.
I'm excited about reading the books once I'm done with the show because I feel like if I am doing both, I'll get confused which one is which. Like the storylines will overlap too much.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely recommend that.
So I'm very much looking forward to soon I will be reading those instead. Yet, and what are we talking about today?
Well, we're going to hopefully answer a bunch of your questions about hosting and how it works and what the differences are and maybe give some information to you and your listeners about what to choose depending on what their projects are.
Ooh, yay. And y'all, I am linking in the link to the tweet, to the Twitter, to the tweet about what I thought was accurate, but it's definitely not. Because I used to work at GoDaddy, and when I worked at GoDaddy, it was like there was regular, what I called regular hosting, because people would call in and be like, "Yo, I need to put my website somewhere," and we would say, "Cool. Do you want to be able to customize it and do things?" And if they're like, "No, I know nothing about it. I just want to be able to have a website," we'd be like, "Great. Here is a website builder, like Squarespace or Wix or something like that." And then after that, it was, if they wanted a little more customization, it was like managed WordPress. And, managed WordPress could do a bit more FTP, but not like a ton more. There's a bit more customization. Or if they wanted all of this like really cool stuff, they could go to cPanel hosting, which was shared hosting. And so that's my hosting knowledge. And then there's Vercel and Netlify. And I'm just like, wait, what? You also technically host and it's free? And I get an SSL? What? And this is where I got very confused. How does this work?
Yeah, and there's a lot to all of that. So let's start with WordPress and let's start with, or not even WordPress, sorry. Let's start with GoDaddy, and let's start with kind of defining what a web page is at the basic level because we're going to be kind of like expanding on that as we go. So I guess quick question for you, Jen. What is the minimum thing you need to have an actual web page?
Minimum thing. Uh, Yes,
Nice, Kevin.
FileZilla.
Yeah.
Yeah, FileZilla is all you need. Yes, and I've talked to many people through FileZilla and SFTP and that kind of thing. Minimum, I almost want to say HTML.
You got it. You need an HTML
Okay,
file.
good. I
You
was like, do you need a domain? And I was like, no, I don't think you technically need
Well,
a
yeah,
domain,
you don't.
but
You can do it via an IP address, but like that's the hosting side, domain, and the host. But like an actual web page
okay.
is just like at the core is an HTML file. Everything else is adding on to that, right? So you have CSS to make it look better, images that will provide visual content, or in some cases background images to make it look better. And then we add in other stuff like JavaScript on the client side or potentially the server side, and then stuff like PHP, Ruby, Python on the server side to allow us to have dynamic content of different types and different looks. So if we think about that with WordPress is basically it's not basically, it's all written in PHP. Um,
I don't think I ever knew that.
that's all written in PHP. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
I don't
mean,
think I ever
I
knew
know
that.
the role that you were at WordPress. Yeah, it was probably one of those things where like the people who knew it thought it was so obvious they wouldn't say it, and like you didn't really need to know it. So like you just kind of you could do your job without really knowing it, and it was
That
so
makes
obvious to the
sense.
people who knew that they didn't bother saying it. But
And
yeah,
it's so crazy because like and for more context of where I think there's so much confusion in this, I also like helped with GoDaddy hosting WordCamps and doing WordPressy things. So like I kept seeing the the consumer side of it, not what happened to build it, which going into software development and coding itself is much more on the infrastructure side of what goes into building it. And that is great call out on why I'm lost of I didn't even know it was PHP. That's cool.
yeah, no, it's all good. Yeah, so it's written in PHP. PHP, like Python, like Ruby, and other languages, every language with JavaScript, is server-side rendered. So what that means is instead of having an index.html file that you can just send directly to the client and the browser can load it, you have an index.php file. If that gets sent directly to the browser's like, I don't know what to do with this. PHP, what's this stuff? So what happens is when you request that page, so like teachgentech.com or whatever,
Hmm.
if that file on the server is an index.php file, the server will read it and it will have a module or support to execute the PHP code, do whatever the instructions are, connect to a database or load information from a file or connect to a third-party API and get information, whatever that is, and it'll execute all that, and then it'll generate an HTML file and send the HTML file to the client, and then the client can display that.
Hi, Ramon. So just to make sure, because I really should just share my screen when I'm doing this, so that way people actually know A, why I'm just staring down awkwardly at my computer, and then or at my hey, look, it says good daddy. Yay. Um, so what you were saying is like PHP goes into like a module that renders it into HTML. Is that what I heard?
Yep, it's a module on the server. So I guess actually, let me even back up a little bit more. Um, any so server is this generic term that can mean a lot of different things. There's server like the hardware server, the actual computer that does stuff, but there can also be servers also used in the context of particular pieces of software. For example, you have a website server or you have an email server, etc. Right?
Right.
So your hardware server uh, that does web hosting will be running a web server software. Uh, when it comes to WordPress, traditionally that was called Apache. Most places have moved over to something called Nginx. Doesn't really matter, but that software accepts requests web-based requests. It looks at what file was requested, checks to see if that file is present on the server, and then will serve that file to the user. Now, serve depends on what exactly that file is. If it's an HTML file, serve will just be sending it to the user. If it's an image or a CSS file, same thing, it'll just send it to the user. If it's, in this case, a PHP file, that piece of web server software will first execute the PHP code and get the final result. And then that final result will be an HTML file, and then send that HTML file to the user.
I think that's also something that may have been very, very clear when I worked at GoDaddy, but like looking back at it, and y'all, for context, I worked at GoDaddy in the email department and the hosting department as sales and support and team leadership for about 5 years. And so, like, it's just funny to me because you said email server, and I'm like, yeah, okay. And you said hardware server, and I'm like, okay, cool, totally get that. And then you said software server, and I'm like, wait, what? That's a thing? Wait, what? Because I think back in the day, even now, I always meant that hardware and software server were like the same. And this is a big reason why Ben said that he has an extra Raspberry Pi I can build. So when I see Ben Gamble next week, I'm gonna get that. And then when I get home sometime next month, I am gonna build it. So I understand hardware a little bit better and doing
Well,
things.
I think the easy comparison here is you have a Mac. You're using a Mac right now,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So your Mac, you're using minimum three things right now. You're using the actual physical computer, which is the
Hmm.
CPU, the hard drive, the RAM, the motherboard, etc. The display. That's the hardware. It's not a server because it's a computer, a personal computer versus a server. Then you have the operating system, which is Mac OS, and then you're using at least a web browser for StreamYards and Twitch and stuff like that. You're probably using
Hmm.
a bunch of other pieces of software, but you're using at
Probably.
least a web browser, right?
Hmm.
So if you think of that, you have the actual physical computer, the operating system, and then the web browser. The comparison on the server side is you have the server hardware. That's just a big, powerful computer hooked up to a very powerful network. And then you have an operating system on servers. It's almost always Linux. Sometimes it's Windows, but it's mostly Linux. And then you have the piece of software that's being used on your computer. It's the web browser. On the flip side, on the server, it's uh, the HTML server, the web server, right? And then your browser and that web server are communicating back and forth.
I am also looking up something for comparison is okay, yes, cPanel, which is what most of GoDaddy's content was using when they were accessing their shared hosting, was cPanel as well. So that helps. Yes, still Linux.
Yep.
Okay.
So cPanel is essentially a tool that lets you access a bunch of different services on the servers on GoDaddy. So cPanel will let you access the FTP server to create or change FTP accounts. I'm
Hmm.
watching you type and trying to say FTP or
Right.
PHP. It also let you create and change FTP accounts. It'll let you access the email server and add and change email accounts. It also provides you access to like an email client, so you can read emails through the web mail. It'll access at least the file browser as well as some other stuff for um, for the web server, so that you can see the files that you have for the website and make changes and upload files. It'll have access to your database, usually via PHP MyAdmin, which is just a tool to manage your database remotely. So cPanel
Hmm.
is just like an interface that brings a bunch of these management tools for all of those different software servers, right? The web server, the FTP server, the email server, the database, which is a server, your domain name server. So it lets you access and manage all of those from one place.
I'm just realizing, like, as you're telling me this, I'm like, I don't think I realized how many types of servers there were.
Yep.
Was a big experience with while streaming with Ben, of talking about how many different caching there is. Like there is like, the computer caching, then you have your browser caching, then you have like he mentioned like 7 others, and it's like,
Yep.
oh, okay. And I'm realizing it's the same way here.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So we going back to the example you gave earlier of like, so WordPress is built with PHP. Cool. Totally didn't realize that. Now, if somebody is taking that PHP dot or index.php, then it is the software server that is turning it into HTML.
Yep. The web server, right?
The web
Specifically.
server.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll go. Yay, another server. So we'll do index.php. And then it goes here, and then it comes out as HTML.
Yep.
Yay.
Assuming everything, all the code works and everything, of course. We'll just, for the sake of today's discussion, we'll assume that there are not, breaking bugs and things failing all over the place.
Who knows? If I'm doing it, it probably will. It's the fun
Happens
part
all
of
the
how.
time, everywhere.
Okay. And so could you give me another definition or way of explaining web server? So is web server basically everything up here except hardware?
No, it's none of those. It's like
It's
its own one.
Yes.
Email, FTP, domain, database, web server, they're all software servers.
Okay. And we will move this.
Software server isn't really like a proper term. I'm more using it to kind of like
just visualize.
Yeah, like people don't usually call them software servers, at least not in my experience.
So, and then we have our one lone hardware server.
I mean, yeah, like it's just physical hardware. It's exactly what it is and how it looks is different in all the different cases.
Okay, cool. I think I'm following at the moment. So WordPress is going to be shared hosting.
It doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to be. Correct.
We're gonna get into that. Don't worry.
Okay.
So yeah, so talking about shared hosting, companies like so there's GoDaddy, there's Bluehost, there's SiteGround, and dozens of others, and they all specialize in WordPress hosting. Most of them offer as their primary service shared hosting. So shared hosting is a very powerful server that handles thousands of sites. Now they make money on this by selling the hosting super cheap, but they also, the reason they call it shared is the resources, the CPU, the RAM, and to a lesser extent, typically the hard drive space is shared between all of the sites. These companies will they will take and put more sites on the server than the server could handle if they were busy. They assume, and rightfully so, because most WordPress sites are not very busy. They're personal sites. They're small business sites that don't see a lot of traffic. They understand that a lot of these sites don't need a ton of resources to run regularly, so they pack a number of sites onto these servers so that they can maximize their profits. But therein lies the problem. They're assuming that these servers aren't that busy. In some cases, if a number of the websites get busy or one or two of the sites get really busy, it can impact other sites on the server.
Ooh, I remember that.
Yeah. And
Um,
let's just, what's the best way to word this? One of the companies that we have talked about today is notorious for being not great at this and having a lot of performance problems by putting too many clients on their shared hosting, um, and causing a lot of performance issues. Um, Different companies will handle that differently. Some will have more more sites, some will have less sites, and so you'll see kind of a different quality in these companies depending on how they're setting up those resources.
that is not what I wanted to draw, but that's fine. Um, so it sounds like it's kind of like airlines or movie theaters. They're going to sell extra tickets than what they actually have seats for.
Yeah, in Canada, we don't. Well, maybe after the pandemic, I haven't been to the movie theater since. To be fair, but before the pandemic, we never oversold our movie theaters up here. But maybe it's a thing now. But definitely like airlines, yeah, yep. Um, and obviously, like airlines, when everyone shows up and no one cancels last minute, you have a problem now. You have too many people for the plane, and you got to figure out what to do. And someone gets upset, or you got to pay someone, or whatever.
I'm really hoping you guys can't hear my dog again because she is
I
unleashed.
like heard that the slightest sound.
Wow, I can't write. Should be shared. We'll go with that. How many are actually shared?
The problem with this is like when it comes to shared hosting, there's no the only answer is like the only answer that's 100% safe is would be based on how many resources you're promising. But that's where you move away from shared hosting and you move to other forms of hosting. Let's see what GoDaddy's offering these days.
I do not think that is how you spell guaranteed, but you know, we're going to go with it. It is a word that I've never been great at spelling. Or maintenance. Anybody really good at spelling maintenance? Because that is also not a good word for me. I don't know
And
why.
somehow I've spelt it a lot, so I'm comfortable with it. But no, I feel your pain with some of these words. Necessarily is one that I always have to like think about. So I'm just checking GoDaddy's offerings to see what they even have.
And if you want to share your screen, just let me know. I am honestly just
I'm just skimming through really quickly.
trying to rewrite guaranteed. Sure, that'll work for now.
Okay, so they have. Looks like the only options they have that would move past shared hosting are either VPS hosting or their dedicated server hosting.
And
I'll talk about it in a second. I'm going to mention when it comes to WordPress hosts, you're going to see a lot of managed WordPress sites, and that's usually something that people pay more for. Managed WordPress hosting or managed WordPress sites basically means that um, they the host company will update WordPress and plugins, which is generally really easy to do, and then they'll tend to add a basic free tier from a software company like Security, and they'll do backups. And that's what managed means. It's just some basic automated stuff. It's not a lot. It certainly isn't. It isn't. It isn't anything on like the server level. It's no different. It's just some management of your site.
thank you. Is it Yar Olinko? When there's no spaces in people's names, I'm always guessing how to say it. Thank
Yeah,
you
like
for the follow.
it's always a guess. Like, is it meant to be part of their first name and last name, or is it like completely made up, or like?
Yeah. I always feel bad because I'm totally always butchering people's names. So yes, I do remember that it was like automated updates if it's a managed WordPress. I'm pretty sure that they used to include SSLs in
No.
managed WordPress.
Oh, maybe. Yeah, maybe.
I don't know. It
I don't
wasn't
think
like
so though.
that's why I always got so confused.
I know you do. At least right now you do. I don't feel like they used to, but I might be wrong.
Yeah, that's why I was like, I don't know. Wait, that's not SSL. SSL. I mean, that could be its own like stream. What's an SSL? Let's not go there. Let's secure socket layer. It's what makes HTTP into HTTPS. Okay, anyway, that's that. So, I believe you also said that there was a VPS and there was one other one, dedicated server. I'm just
Dedicated.
writing it.
Yep.
Cool.
Yep. So VPS is actually um, VPS works kind of the same as shared hosting. The difference is, so VPS stands for Virtual Private Server. So Virtual Private Server, you take that big powerful hardware server and you slice it up into essentially, like, think of like slicing it up into slices of pie. In the case of VPS, they can be different slices. One slice could be small and it has one virtual CPU core, you know, 4 gigs of RAM and like 50 gigabytes of SSD space. And then another one could be a little bit bigger and it's twice that, two virtual CPU cores, 8 gigs of RAM, 100 gigs of space. Um, the key with this is that whatever your VPS service like settings are, those are yours. You pay for them and you have them. They're not shared with anyone, right? So um, if you are supposed to have 4 gigs of RAM, you'll have access to 4 gigs of RAM. So you don't have to worry about other sites affecting the performance of your site. The only reason you would run out of resources is that your site gets busier and you would need to upgrade your VPS to something more powerful.
And if I remember correctly, oh, thanks, Ryan.
Yeah,
I
you.
am grateful that people do like my handwriting because I'm like, I don't know what I would do if I couldn't be writing all of this out because I was like, it helps my brain so much.
I
Um,
I write stuff out, but no, I feel sorry for anyone who has to try to read my handwriting. It's the
really
exact
funny,
opposite of yours.
really funny. If my mom ever caught one of these streams and saw my handwriting, she would still tell me I have horrible handwriting. But that's because I never properly learned cursive. But there's like words that you'll see that I write that are like half cursive, half um like
Yeah, I do that too.
regular.
Yeah,
Do they still teach cursive in school?
I
Anybody know?
have no clue.
I'm so curious.
I've I've been out of school for a very long time, and I have no kids who are learning, so couldn't tell you. Maybe someone in chat knows.
Yes, somebody in chat, please riddle us this because I am very, very curious. I'm moving this over because I feel like something that also needs to be added here, which I think is another part of the confusion. I didn't want to just default go to GoDaddy colors, so let's like use a different green. Um, is when it's like a managed WordPress, it's definitely not as much to technical knowledge needed as like plugins and stuff like that. From this is going off of memory. When going to a cPanel or shared hosting like that or like VPS is you need somebody that can manage the resources better. So um when somebody called in for hosting and they set up like cPanel is what I'll call it. It was like GoDaddy, and this is 5+ years ago, y'all. I don't know what they currently offer. Uh, is like their shared hosting would be like, cool, if you're having some issues with the resources, we'll help you figure it out. Where like with the VPS, if you're having issues with your resources, you're shit out of luck. Like, go figure it out yourself. You have to have more of an admin. And I believe it was the same with a dedicated server.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Generally, with VPS, you're going to take more ownership of setting it up yourself. That said, I honestly would never recommend using like any of the big WordPress hosts like GoDaddy, Bluehost, SiteGround, etc. I wouldn't recommend doing a VPS through them. So actually, I guess I should have covered this in the intro, but before I got into full stack development for a while, I built WordPress sites for small
Oh,
businesses.
I never knew
Um,
that. That's so cool. I always just think Roy is a wealth of knowledge, and when I'm stuck on stuff, I just listen to everybody playing like Apex and stuff, and when I can hear that there's a break, I'll just ask them questions while they're doing that. So I'm just like so used to you just knowing lots of stuff, but that makes a lot of sense.
yeah. So I still have a few clients that I'm handling their sites for. They'll be moving to other people in the WordPress field by end of next month because I've been away from doing WordPress stuff and I'm just kind of cycling that down. But for years now, I've had my own VPS from DigitalOcean running. It's got like ridiculous uptime. Um, and then I use a service called RunCloud, which is kind of targeted towards WordPress users, and it manages the VPS for me. So it sets up user accounts, it sets up um, database stuff, it sets up web applications. It's like cPanel, but for VPS, and so it just makes it really easy to manage the server side of things. Um, I can actually I don't know if it's sharing. Yeah, let's share the screen.
Cool.
I can share
Let
this.
me do. And thank you, Ryan. I appreciate it. Find out if they're still learning cursive.
Here we go.
And that I think is another question that I'm going to write down for a little later on is let me grab that. Sweet.
So this is my RunCloud dashboard. I have 3 client sites here, so it's winding down. And then what I have, you can see I'm running PHP MyAdmin, and I've got like a tool installed here to let me manage those sites. I used to have a lot more sites, so this would let me manage. Like I think I had 25 sites at one point, so let me manage them all at once. But I can go in here and I can go in and add a new database for a new site.
Oh
I
my
can
gosh.
add a new system users, change passwords, um, and then I set up SSH so that I can connect to the server, and then web applications. So this is creating the actual web application. So like if I do deploy a new web app, I can go WordPress or PHP MyAdmin, and then give it a name, give it a domain, etc., and then deploy it with backups and everything like that. So it manages everything. I can choose my PHP version, all this stuff in here.
Do you want to know something really funny that just clicked?
Sure.
Okay. So I knew from my time at GoDaddy that you wouldn't like something like manage WordPress or cPanel or any of these. They had a database, MySQL, and then you'd have to log in to PHP MyAdmin to go manage the server or manage the database. Why did that not click 4 weeks ago when I started learning Postgres? You have to have the server, you have to have the client.
Yep. When something like that clicks, you're like, that's so obvious in retrospect.
It is
Yeah.
like it is completely obvious, and I'm just like, really, Jen? Really? Like, oh my god, I
And
feel very silly.
while I use Postgres as my database in most cases, Postgres clients definitely aren't quite as nice as PHP MyAdmin. PHP MyAdmin for SQL, MySQL and MariaDB databases is really really good.
I will hopefully remember to look that up later on because I feel like that is definitely something to look into. One thing that is also coming to mind is that you were talking. I feel like I need to ask you first about dedicated server, and then I will go back to asking you about.
Dedicated server really is just GoDaddy upselling services. It's I think just looking here, I'm pretty sure that the best way to think of dedicated server is just yeah. So you may hear this term called bare metal servers, and essentially what that is you're renting the hardware, the bare metal, because servers are made of metal plus PCBs and silicone and other stuff, but metal. And then you choose what operating system you build your server from the ground up. It would be like you going to the store and buying the parts for a computer, right? And they slap together the computer, but they don't put any software on it. You bring it home, and now do you install Windows? Do you install Linux? Do you install something else? Which version do you install? Which Linux do you install?
So this one, y'all, I talk about Tyler on again, off again. That's my partner for the last 5 years. Yay. And he also used to work at GoDaddy and was a lot more into the technical side of things, but it was more of it's hard to compare it to what I'm learning now because he went in a completely different direction. And but I know that I can ask him about the dedicated server, and I think this is a good way that I can knowledge check because I'm like, I think so, but I feel like it still wasn't like bare metal. It was like they just had a more allotment. I don't know. I don't remember. I'll have to ask him about it. But you still need to have somebody to log in and set up and manage all of it. It's not something that a hosting provider would do.
For
So,
bare metal, no.
yeah. Okay, so this is making sense. So I guess I didn't need to move that all the way over. We'll move that back. Great.
Actually,
So
looking at GoDaddy, they do offer a fully managed one where they manage it, but yeah.
there's still stuff they didn't manage. At least back then when they had fully managed.
Well, I mean, reasonably, there's a point where you want to do stuff that they just don't deal with, right? But
Yeah.
that's kind of a different discussion.
Right. So would you say that DigitalOcean is like kind of an almost an in between before we go to Vercel and Netlify? Because DigitalOcean, because they can do Docker as well, right? You can install Docker on DigitalOcean.
DigitalOcean, let's not call DigitalOcean an in between because DigitalOcean offers a few different things. They offer VPS. They offer a kind of Vercel Netlify like service. It's definitely not as mature or as involved. And then
Okay.
yeah, you can do like Docker and stuff like that. So it's its own one. But I think before we go any further, there's still a couple of things we want to touch on. So when you're talking about nice soy milk, yeah. I mean, if you saw what I was sharing there with Run Club, that was off DigitalOcean. All those sites were on there, so I definitely use DigitalOcean a bunch myself too. Um, yeah, I didn't configure it myself. I couldn't be bothered. I just let RunCloud handle it so that I could save time and money and sanity. But I've set up Nginx a few times. But yeah, so when you talk about GoDaddy, if you talk about a VPS, a lot of hosting options, what you're talking about is a single server in a single location somewhere in the world. For example, my DigitalOcean VPS is in Toronto, Toronto, Canada. So if someone was trying to connect to my server from California or further away, like Australia or Europe, there's going to be a delay because while the internet's fast, it still can take, a chunk of a second to make that transit per file that's required, per request that's made. And that adds up, right? So there's all sorts of things that can affect performance. One of them is just waiting as the client to get a response from the server. And the further that response has to travel, the bigger that delay is. When you start talking about performance for websites, you'll see things like time to first byte, which is essentially time to first. You've heard that term before?
Yeah, and then we always had to do a oh God. It was in, what was it called? Where we had to have them run on their computer if it was even hitting the site. Because
Probably
whether
like
or
a
not,
ping or something like that. There's a bunch of
yeah,
tools you
so
could have used. Yeah.
yeah, something like that. Ugh. Ugh.
Time to first byte is a good metric. What time to first byte is I send a request to a web server. What is the time in milliseconds until I get the first byte of a response, the first hit of a response? Because that time to first byte. Like, let's say you're going from Australia to Toronto, Canada, and back. That time to first byte could easily be 500. Yes, exactly. The first taste of a byte. That time could easily be 500 or more milliseconds. It's like that's a significant travel time for data, depending on the user's network, depending on the server. Some of that is how quickly the server responds when they get the request. But the key there is that that time to first byte is time before the user starts to get any information, and the longer that time is, the longer the delay will be for any request. Now, if you think of a WordPress site, the content, right, the index page, the blog articles, the WooCommerce products, the whatever, right, that stuff is all dynamic. And it updates sometimes frequently, sometimes infrequently. It depends on the site. Sometimes yearly. It depends on the particular site. But other things don't update. There might be a new version, but it's a separate version. That's images and CSS, right? CSS can get updated, but essentially we tend to treat it as a new version for the sake of caching. And then images, same idea. Something to be aware of when we talk about this is if you link to the same image, right? If your browser links to the same image and it already has a copy, it'll say, well, I've already downloaded a copy. I'm not going to download a new copy. Same with JavaScript files, same with CSS files. So when we get to JavaScript tooling, one of the things that happens is when we generate the CSS files, the JavaScript files, the tooling gives it like a hash code in the file name. So the file names are always different. And the browser will update or get the new version of the file anytime you change. If you're just editing a CSS file, the browser won't automatically update it. But anyway, the key is most of this stuff doesn't change often or at all. So we start using a content delivery network, a CDN. So what a CDN is, so I have my
Really quick, before we go to a CDN, just to go back to the caching and things like that, which ones did you say that it normally caches? Is it any type of CSS or HTML or images?
CSS, JavaScript files, and images.
Okay, because is that mostly just on WordPress sites, or would that be on any type of?
That's the
Sorry?
browser behavior. That's the browser behavior.
Okay, that's okay. Cool.
Yep.
And that's going to be even if they were on something like Netlify or Vercel, or no?
Same thing. Yep.
Same thing. Okay.
The
It's
browser
browser
does.
behavior. I just wanted to make sure.
Yep.
Like,
The
ask you in
browser
7 different ways.
the browser does it based on file name. It doesn't really know whether it's a WordPress site or a React site. It just is like, hey, that's an image. and I have already gotten a copy of an image with that name, I don't need to grab a new copy. I'm just going to use the save copy.
And then if anybody hosts with Libsyn, which is a podcast host, they really do it with images. So even if it's a brand new episode that you're putting out, if the image itself that you're uploading is called the same, it will use the old image and put it out to all of your other stuff. In
Yep.
case anybody wanted to know, that was really awkward when I first realized that. So it caches HTML, CSS.
Not HTML. Not HTML.
Not HTML. Okay. Actually, instead of that, I am going to do this. So that way I can really see that it doesn't do HTML. I think I was using my color. CSS, images.
And JavaScript.
And Java. It's weird to spell out JavaScript. Okay.
And again, just to note that caching is based off file name.
Sweet. Okay, cool.
Okay. So we look at the site. It's comprised of HTML, CSS, images, JavaScript. The CSS, images, and JavaScript don't tend to change. They also tend to be larger files than the HTML, which means it takes longer for them to get transferred over the network. So in order to improve performance, I have my server in Toronto, Canada. What I can do is engage the services of a content delivery network, and it will cache those CSS, images, JavaScript. It can even cache the HTML, but we'll talk about that more later. And what they will do, so you have content being CSS, images, JavaScript. You have delivery, which we'll talk about in a second, and then you have network. Network means that you have servers all over the world. Oops. And let me just see if I can find a quick image.
And CDNs can also help on security, can't they?
Sort of. Here, I'm going to send this to you in the StreamYard's chat. You can open that up on your end.
Okay, cool. Give me a second, y'all. I really should have just been doing it like this from the beginning, but I tried to make it like bigger for everyone, but this does make the most sense. Ta-da!
Okay, so this is actually from an image from Cloudflare's article on what a content delivery network is. But what we can see is you have the origin server, that's the orange one that all the orange arrows point to, and then you have the CDN server. So those are the blue rectangles, and then you have the users with their little fake laptops. So in the case of using a CDN, what it does is it takes those images, JavaScript files, CSS files, and it stores them on all of those CDN servers. And there's more than these. This shows 5, just so the image isn't too spammy. But it would have, Cloudflare has, I imagine, probably several dozen around the world. So what ends up happening is you're always going to be close to a CDN server, or relatively close to a CDN server. So when you visit that website in Toronto and get the HTML file, and your browser looks through it and says, oh, I need 7 images, 2 CSS files, and 4 JavaScript files, the request goes to a local CDN that your request gets to a lot faster. It has a very fast time to first byte, and it delivers those assets really quickly. A content delivery network, so we understand the content part, the network part. The delivery part is these are optimized to deliver the data to the user very quickly. The whole idea is to get that content to the user as quickly as possible. And CDNs are used behind the scenes all over the place. Discord has a CDN, so anything that is like all the images and stuff like that that are part of Discord, whether that's user avatars, whether that's Discord banners, images that are uploaded into Discord itself, they're all spread around on Discord CDN. Amazon uses a CDN extensively so that they can deliver web pages very quickly. If you think of an Amazon web page, it should be slow to load because they have like 50 images and they're huge, but their CDN delivers that content very, very quickly. YouTube is a great example. YouTube is delivering videos, which are huge files, but they deliver it through their video CDN quickly. So this is a way to improve performance. And understanding what a CDN is will help with when we start talking about Vercel and Netlify, because they expand upon this.
Oh. Okay.
Oh, we just got a huge raid.
Oh, yay. Hello, everyone. How's it going? That's exciting. I look down, look away, and everybody comes to show up. I appreciate that. And hello, all you beautiful humans. We are hanging out, talking about... Oh, it's Coding Garden. Yay! Well, Raid and Run, thanks for coming over. We are talking about hosting, because if y'all want to see a really fun tweet that I may or may not have made earlier last week that was slightly embarrassing, of when you feel like you're getting stuff and then you really don't. That is what we are working on learning about with... And anybody that doesn't have Twitter nor want to, this is the tweet of... So when something gets deployed on Vercel or Netlify, are they actually hosting the site, or are they not, because it's grabbing the content from GitHub? A lot of that, like, kind of weird knowledge comes from my time at GoDaddy. I was there for 5 years. I was in hosting, sales, and support. And it was much more taught about, like, how do you talk about it? How do you sell it to people that are not normally as technical? We'll go with that. So it was a really hard comparison to what I've been learning so far since having teach Gen Tech, of this is what it actually is. And to catch you up, and Roy, now we're going to see if I can knowledge check myself. We are going over, we started with just a bit of GoDaddy thing, so that way we could go, okay, cool, get my like base knowledge out there and get an understanding check of, like, a website at least needs HTML. Got it. And yes, y'all, I do know about domains and SSLs and, DNS and all that. It's helpful when talking to a customer, but not always helpful when I'm just trying to level up my technical expertise. So yes, we might go through some basics. We talked about that there's many different servers. In a past stream with Ben Gamble, I've talked about, I'm learning a lot more about data and types of data, because data is one of those things that a lot of people talk about, yet not always go into detail about. And you can see a bit more about that here. And to keep going down the list, we started talking about shared hosting. It's like when somebody decides that they want to sell the seats in an airplane, but then sell more seats than they actually have room for, hoping not everybody shows up. And that's what shared hosting does a lot of time. And then we talked a bit about managed WordPress, VPS, of like virtual private server, dedicated servers. And right now we are going on to CDNs and caching and what CDNs do. Is that a good recap?
That's a solid recap.
Sweet. And thank you everyone for the follows. I appreciate it. And as a heads up, this week particularly, we are talking about, yes, a lot of my channel is towards beginners. I'm learning all of this live. This week is like really, really beginner friendly because tomorrow we're also talking about what is an API. And today we're talking about hosting. Um, so a little bit more of the beginner level than some of our other streams where we talk about what are some of the more technical ones that I've talked about? I'm trying to think.
TypeScript for
Quick.
sure. Quick,
Type.
yeah.
Oh yeah, we talk about TypeScript every other week. I really enjoy TypeScript. That one's fun. And yeah. So we do a lot of random topics. Kubernetes, Docker. Oh yeah. Okay, back to CDN world. All right, so we have our content delivery network, Cloudflare gave us this very, very lovely description of photo of how it works around how close you are to the original server based on a CDN will repeat it, would you say?
No, they literally copy the files. It's they so like your all the CDN nodes will have copies of those files until there's a new copy available.
Okay.
So when you there's options for like when you're updating your site to invalidate your CDN cache, which basically says, okay, well, let's go and get new copies of all of those files. So it tosses the old stuff and gets the new copies. But yeah, no, the assets that are being cached on the CDN are copied from the origin server and then stored on the CDN.
Okay.
And
And
there's
that,
like I'm simplifying how they get there because actually typically what happens is typically the first visitor from afar will connect to a CDN node. The CDN node will typically see are those assets cached, and if not, then it will go and get them from the origin server, cache them, and send them to the user at the same time. But like for how it works, I don't really want to get too much into that. Um, the CDN is a cache. It's not. It's like it
oh,
literally is a
okay.
cache. Yeah. Yep.
No matter what. Okay.
Yep. That's
It's
the
been a
whole.
hot minute since
Yeah.
I've because it I just remember having to like talk people through having to clear the CDN. But then this is kind of went to another question of what about site lock is the I don't even know if site lock is still a thing. Let's find out. Is what I'm remembering as having like it did malware, but then it also had a CDN as well. And it's something that GoDaddy worked with. And I don't know if that is accurate at all. Hide.
It
Okay.
looks like
Yes. Solutions. Ooh. Well, that's I wanted the drop down. Thanks, but no thanks.
yeah. So it includes a content delivery network. Yeah. So
Okay.
the it does a lot of security stuff. So it'll look for um, malware. So the one of the things, like just as a quick tangent, one of the things with WordPress sites is a lot of times they're not updated regularly,
Hmm.
and then when they fall behind, their plugins uh, will have security vulnerabilities exposed. Those plugins don't get updated, and the site is vulnerable to an attack. If you ever go and look through the logs for a WordPress site, you'll see dozens, hundreds of scripted attacks. So the people who have malicious intent will just go and try to find all of these domains that they can, and will just take all of these vulnerability attacks and just script them and just run them blindly against the site. They don't know if your WordPress site has WooCommerce. They don't know if it has Plugin X. They don't even know if your site has WordPress. They just run a bunch of attacks to see if any of them work.
Is that going to be different than a DDoS attack?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So these ones are attempting to use a vulnerability to gain, access or control of your site, right? So they can change the content, so they can display some crypto scam or whatever it is they want to do. And in some way take over the site and take over the content. Whereas DDoS is, so like DOS is denial of service, DDoS is distributed denial of service, meaning there's multiple computers involved in the attack. And the whole idea with DDoS is just that it makes your site non-responsive, so that your services can't be used by anyone. So, someone was trying to DDoS ping over the last couple of weeks. And if they had been successful, which they weren't, they were not even close to successful. But if they had been successful, ping wouldn't have worked. It would have been non-responsive because it would have been overloaded.
Interesting. Okay, well, there's lots to learn there, and I'm just kind of putting these as side notes. Literally,
Yep.
They're off to the side.
Yeah, they're definitely tangents. We definitely don't want to spend long on there.
Yeah. Right. So if we go back to this.
Yep. So the CDN, I think we're done with. We're good there. I think the last piece of the GoDaddy hosting to talk about is just super simple, and that's how do you get your WordPress site onto GoDaddy, right? You set it up locally, you have it working, or maybe you just need to move it from one hosting site to another. You would upload that via FTP, which is file transfer protocol, and that copies the files from your computer or from another computer to your server. So
you want to know something really funny?
What?
While working at GoDaddy, I did not realize that you built things on your computer and then uploaded them. Like localhost 3000 or whatever you set your localhost up. No idea.
Yep.
Did not know that was a thing.
With WordPress, it doesn't need to be, because like a huge part of the WordPress marketplace is install WordPress, install somewhere between 5 and 30 plugins, I would say, depending on your setup. And they take care of all of the kind of functionality. And that includes, and then you also have themes, which can, like the advanced themes, can let you do all of the visual configuration right in WordPress. So you don't need to edit CSS files. You just go into the theme file and you can, or the theme admin panel, and you can, configure the visual side of your site. So WordPress allows people to build a site completely without needing to do local development or to do any like actual programming. A huge number of WordPress sites exist and no one has done any programming specific to their site. Obviously, someone built all the plugins and WordPress and that stuff, but no one did any specific engineering related to their site. They just, plugins were installed, and web and like interfaces, dashboards inside WordPress were used, and everything gets configured. But obviously, in some cases, especially bigger sites, there's lots of custom development that's done. And the key here is with FTP, because we'll talk about it from a different angle later, is there has to be some way to move the files if you're doing local development to the host. And FTP is one option.
I'm missing a word. Move site to site. And y'all, for who are new to the channel, again, welcome. As a heads up, I am wonderfully, horribly dyslexic. And I miss words. I also misspell like almost everything. So if you're like, Jen, what are you writing? Be forewarned, I will have probably just didn't even realize I did it. So feel free to let me know if something is misspelt or missing something as I write my notes on all of this, or if something is not legible. And again, thank you everybody for the follows. I see the last two is Mark and lurk lurk mode activated. I like that name. That is a pretty dope name. All right. So FTP move shit. We got that. Isn't there a size limit for FTP? Like you can't do like over 25 megabytes or something? And this is
There can be a size limit based on server configuration, but
ah
generally speaking, there's no like the FTP protocol doesn't have like a actual size limit.
okay, cool. And you said there was something else you wanted to mention about that one?
No, that's all.
Oh, that's
That's
easy.
just that's just how to get the files from the local computer to the server, because we will kind of talk about that process from a different angle when we talk about Vercel.
Uh, file limit, big file size limit. Go back, go back, 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 back. Okay, where do we go to now?
Now we can go to Vercel.
Oh my goodness, look at all these notes. We're gonna maybe moving this stuff over. Maybe. Well, that didn't select everything. Goodness gracious. There we go. And we'll just move it up here with everything else. Maybe. Eh? Yay! Okay, that was fun. That was shared hosting. And now we're on Vercel. Let's get excited about some Vercel.
So Vercel is a tool that wraps a bunch of these things together. And it does it to make it easier to manage your site. It makes it easier to develop your site, and so that you don't have to worry about a lot of this stuff.
Okay.
So we'll kind of work backwards, because with Vercel, you're not going to create. There's no like when you're signing up to Vercel, you don't get to create a site on Vercel.
Right.
You have to transfer something to Vercel, and the way that that's done is GitHub, or you could use GitLab, or Bitbucket, I think is the other one. I can never remember the proper name for it. And so this is where we talk about the difference between FTP and Git. So Git is a way to take snapshots of your code as you work on it, and then also to take those snapshots and move them to a remote repo where they can be merged with work from other people. So if you and I are working on something together and we have that in the same Git repo and we both upload changes to the site, those changes can be merged together. Git tries to be smart about it, and it says, oh, well, Jenn worked on index.html and Roy worked on index.css. There's no conflicts there. I can just merge these. But let's say we both worked on index.html, it'll be like, okay, well, what lines and what code did Jenn change? Oh, she changed lines 50 to 100. Roy worked on 173 to 300. Okay, there's no conflict there. They worked on different code. I can merge those. In some cases, you work on the same code, and then you have to do a merge conflict where you have to choose what code to keep or how to merge those lines. But ultimately, you end up with those different pieces of work being merged into one on that remote repo. And then once that's done, everyone who's working on the project can download the new copy via git pull, and everyone has the most up-to-date code. So Git obviously has a bunch of things in place to transfer the files from your local computer to a remote repo, which is going back to the servers we were talking about. You have a Git server. GitHub is a Git server. You could, if you had a company that was large enough or wanted to manage it themselves, you could install a Git server on your own computer, your own hardware server, and then have your own internal repo.
Okay, so so you can have like just to because I know I was writing at the same time. To repeat that back to you, we can they use a Git server, and you can have your own Git server,
If you want to, yeah.
like bare metal Git server, um or just like a larger account, I guess.
You can install it on however you wanted. You could do it on a bare metal server where you would have to install the operating system first, or you could do it on a VPS. Um, there's certainly a bunch of different ways to do that, but you can you can run your own Git server if you wanted to.
And do you get this question of uh oh, desktop. Okay. Uh,
No, Get Desktop is a client application. As far as I know, I don't use the GUI ones too often, but I'm pretty sure Get Desktop is 100% client side. I don't think it runs any server side stuff.
I keep forgetting
Um,
that is.
this is a link to the Get docs on setting up the server. I don't really want to go into that too much because it's not super relevant to work to like kind of the specifics of what we're talking about today. But essentially, you're setting up a server using just command line Git, and then anyone can connect to that and use that as a repo. Um, a huge number of people use GitHub because obviously GitHub already has a bunch of stuff in place um, to handle that. You can easily set up projects, you can set up organizations, you can give access to people, um, tons of stuff, and then you also don't have to worry about um, you know managing all of the costs if your repo is large and stuff like that. GitHub is pretty like it's free for the most part. If you need to pay for it, it's pretty reasonably priced as well. Um, unless you get into an enterprise or whatever, and if you're in enterprise, you're making enough money, hopefully, for your company that the cost of the enterprise doesn't even matter. But the key is that at some point you end up with a remote repository. We'll talk about it from GitHub side of things. You end up with a remote repository that has the code for your web app, your project in place. And usually that most up to date is on something like your main branch. Um, so Vercel, when you're setting up Vercel, in order to make things easier on developers, to make things easier to set up Vercel initially, and to make things easy to use Vercel and to update Vercel over time, it connects with something like your GitHub account, or specifically your repo in your GitHub account. So when you set up Vercel, you'll link it to a specific repo. It assumes by default that the most up-to-date code is in main. You can change that. It does a really good job of detecting what framework you're using. So if your repo is solid.js, it's going to recognize that it's solid.js. If it's next.js, it'll 100% recognize next.js, because if for anyone who's listening who doesn't know, next.js is written and managed by Vercel, so they obviously make sure Next works flawlessly. It'll recognize remix or anything like that, and then when it recognizes that stuff, it automatically will use the default build and build commands for that. So it configures the project. So generally, if you're using like any sort of normal framework, and you haven't done any sort of weird configuration changes, it can detect that and set that up for you, and it takes just a few seconds. So what Vercel will do is it watches GitHub. Actually, I'll give you a second to. I wouldn't say language; it's framework.
Yeah, you're right.
framework, or just call it framework. Technically, it can also do like you can technically do like create React app, which isn't a framework, but it doesn't really matter. Framework's fine. To answer Returner's question, you could deploy Next.js very easily to you should be able to put it very easily onto Vercel or Netlify. You just have to add it to a GitHub repo and then connect Vercel or Netlify to that GitHub repo, and it should be deployed without any issue.
That's what I was just thinking, because if we go to, not Verizon, we don't want to go to Verizon. I used to work there too. That's fine. We'll just okay, we don't need to look at that. But like, do you have Returner, do you have it on a server or do you have it on just local? Because I don't know about Git Desktop if it's not set up correctly, because it does ask you to link it to your GitHub. Like, you have to authenticate. Sure, we're going to say that's all right. You have to authenticate into your GitHub, for example, and tell it which one to load to. So that's how I have mine set up, and it tells me which GitHub project that I need it to go to, which repo to go to.
Yeah. Returner, I would say that if you're getting errors, there are probably a couple of things that you can look at. Number one, if you have put anything into a .env file, you want to go into Vercel or Netlify to the project where you're trying to deploy, and there'll be settings. Jenn can show us if she goes to click on website on Vercel.
Right where, oh, like, I don't know where that is. There's a lot of things.
Click on settings.
Settings.
And then environment variables. So if you have anything in a .env file, you would go in here in Vercel, and there's an equivalent in Netlify, and you would add those key value pairs in here. Your .env file won't be getting uploaded to, or shouldn't be getting uploaded to GitHub. And even if it is, Vercel won't read the contents of it. So you want to put those .env values in here. That's one thing to look at. Locally, you can run your next build command. So that should be npm run build or npx space next space build, and it'll build. That's the same process that happens when it tries to deploy on next. The build process is different than the npm run dev, the development server. The npm run build is more strict and will often error out on things that the development server doesn't error out on. So if you get errors doing the npm run build, you can check those errors and look at resolving them. They could be TypeScript errors or things like React strict related errors, stuff like that. So you can take a look at that. If you can do an npm run build without errors and you've uploaded your .env files, you should be able to deploy without problems. But yeah, I don't certainly want to help you, but at the same time, we don't want to turn this into a troubleshooting stream, at least not yet. Maybe later on after.
Maybe later on, yeah, eventually. This is something that I will say that I've run into. I built my site with Astro, and I have had it where it would run locally, but it wouldn't deploy on Vercel. Yep. That's why I was just looking up my logs, and I don't remember what it was, but it took me like an hour of lots and lots of Googles to try to figure out what it was, and it was like a file wasn't uploading properly or something like that. I don't remember, but yes, it can happen, but those logs will definitely help you out.
Yeah. So the key with all of this is when you're getting set up, if you're looking at trying to diagnose problems, one of the first things you should always do with any of the frameworks is run their build command. So when you run npm run dev on your Next or your Astro or whatever locally, it runs a development server. A development server doesn't build the JS bundles and the CSS bundles the same way as you need for an actual not development, a actual production server.
You just reminded me, sorry to interrupt, but I think it was a JavaScript error that I had to update my JavaScript because it wasn't reading the most recent version of like TypeScript or something like that.
Yep, it could be anything like that. The key is that the build step is when you do npm run build, it's going to build all of those JavaScript bundles, CSS files, etc., the way it would for deploying it. So basically the difference is when you are developing, it doesn't build those files because what it wants to be able to do is on most of the frameworks is do a hot module reload, meaning when you make a change on one of your files and you save it, your development server says, oh, you changed this file or you changed that file. It reads those changes and it automatically injects them into your development server and what you're looking at locally. So if you change your CSS and you save, it will automatically update your project and where you're looking at it locally in the browser at like localhost 3000 or whatever. You'll immediately see that update and be able to see what's going on. But that part of that is because it doesn't go and build a CSS file, in the sense of the way it will when it gets deployed. But the build command will do that. So it'll take and build an actual CSS file. So if you're working with, say, Tailwind and you do an npm run build command and you look at the build folder after, you'll find an actual index.css or styles.css, whatever you call it. You'll find that actual file with all of your styles in it. And you'll be able to take a look at them. And you'll find the actual rendered HTML file. You'll find it's going to be a small file, but it'll be there. You'll find your JavaScript files, and they'll all be in their build one. So yeah, anytime you're having a problem deploying, do your build command locally and check your errors, because that's one of the things that's going to happen when you deploy in Vercel, which is what we're going to talk about. So you've set up your Vercel account, you've linked it to your GitHub repo, right?
Yes.
Now what Vercel is going to do is say, okay, I am going to take a copy of the code that is in the main branch, and
Okay.
I am going to pull it over to Vercel. I am going to do the npm install the packages. Then I'm going to do an npm run build or equivalent commands. And I'll keep saying npm run build, but that can be different depending on the framework.
Yeah.
Potentially. It'll do the npm run build command and build the deployable assets, and then we'll take that and we will add it to our edge network, which we'll talk about in more detail, and we'll make that live so people can access the site. So if you're in Vercel, you can look at your build logs, and that's the process of what it's doing there.
Can I just say I feel like I wasn't that far off, because I was like, yo, it's just running npm run build.
Right,
I
but
just didn't know the edge network part.
well, you also in your original tweet had thought it was running it on GitHub, which it's not.
Because it's pulling the information from GitHub, because I didn't know about edge network, because I was like,
well, the run build is before the edge network.
Yeah. And that's why I'm like, I didn't know it existed. So I was like, where else could the content have come from?
Right.
So that's why I'm excited. Don't mind me. Yeah. Okay.
So yeah. So then it takes those built files. So you have your core HTML file in the case of something like React. Has all your CSS files, your JavaScript files, your images, etc. And it makes them available for people to visit the site. And so now people can visit your website and access it. Now, this is where it starts to get a little more complicated, because when we were talking GoDaddy and WordPress, we talked about server-side rendering. everything that's PHP is server-side rendered because the browser can't render it. JavaScript gets into this not weird, but this more complicated situation where you can have server-side rendered, like basically like PHP. You can have static site generation, which you can also do with PHP and WordPress, but it also includes client-side, or what's often referred to as single-page applications.
Okay.
So if you're using Next by default, it is a single page application, a SPA. If you're using Astro by default, it's a static site generator by default. I think actually only the static site generator. So the key here is, depending on the framework and depending on how you have it configured, the behavior can be a little bit different. So we'll talk about Next and its like default version first. And so it's a SPA, single page application. So what that means is there's an index.html file. It has some SEO stuff, and then it just has like an empty div with an ID, and the JavaScript that's part of React will look for that ID, and then the JavaScript will create all of these divs and headers and stuff like that.
You said it was just a single page application?
Yep. Yep. That's what, like, if you go and look at Next, you'll find that there's a public folder, and in actually Next's not like that. I don't think, I can't even remember anymore. Been messing around with other frameworks. I think Next just auto generates it now. But you end up with just a single app, like an index page with an empty div where the content will be injected. And so the application will, which is the JavaScript, will generate the page on the client. So the browser is running the JavaScript, and that JavaScript says, hey, create a div. Okay, inside of that div, create another div and give it these CSS classes. And inside of that div, give it a H1 tag and then this text, like teach Gen Tech. And then close that and close that div. And then let's create another div and call that, give that some other CSS classes. And then inside of there, let's add this content for a blog post. And it sort of render all of this, and then it takes all of that rendered HTML and it shoves it into that empty div.
Okay.
And then if the client clicks on another link in the application, so they want to go to a different page, it renders that new page, takes all the content for that new page, erases what's in the div, that top level div in the index file, and shoves in the new HTML.
Oh, okay. Hold on. Before you keep going, let me rewrite this so I can. Okay, so it would be an index.js with
index.html.
Oh, it would be index. Okay, yeah. Index.html, and then it would be with empty div.
Yep.
And then then the rest of them would be like a .js, like it could be gen.js, and
nope,
then it would
there wouldn't be anything like that. No, so that's where you want to. This is what's complicated with SPAs. There would be no JavaScript files or HTML files that relate to what we think of as pages. It's a single page, index.html. What happens is, inside of the JavaScript code, it says what route is the user trying to access. So the slash is your main route, like what you would get if you went to teachgentech.com. And then there would be another route, /blog or /about or /content. And so you have some sort of router package that manages that. In the case of Next, that's file-based routing. So people get confused with Next because you create these files like, oh, if I want to have a contact page, I create a file called contact.js or JSX or TS or TSX. but there's not actually a page. When that next application is built, if it's being built as a SPA, all of that JavaScript just gets moved into a bundle. And then there's router that says, oh, you're trying to go to /blog, will render the HTML for /blog. But there's no corresponding file. It's all handled in JavaScript.
So where would you write it?
Write what?
The information that it's rendering.
You write it in the case of Next, you would write it in a blog.ts file or a /blog/ whatever file. But when it's the key is that during the build process, all of that JavaScript gets amalgamated into just bundles that get loaded by index.html.
Okay. So I think I understand this better now. So if it's going to be a blog like this, it would be, we'll say, teachandtech.jts, and then whatever is here, I'm going to change colors. Yay, colors. Let's do purple. Whatever is written in file. Goodness gracious, please ignore the dog. And yay, thank you for another follow. Whatever is written in the file will be built in the index.html in that dev.
Not quite. So let's move that blog thing down.
Okay, give me a second to get the dog out of the room. So just a sec. Doggo, you need to go this way. Oh, good girl. She is an old lady, so she's a grumpy old lady. There. Kicked her out of my office for now. Okay, so you said move the blog.
Yeah, move that down so we have some room.
Oh, I gotta move my P back. There we go.
All right. Cool. So what happens is when we do the build command, you'll end up with something like index.js. So we'll call it index.js. It can be named differently, but index.html will load index.js.
Okay.
So you can do I would do a little L arrow down from index.html and say index.js. And then you can just in brackets say created during build step.
Okay.
And then everything below, so your blog page, your index, your main page, your video page, your blog articles, your contact page, everything else during the build step will get turned into JavaScript and get put into index.js. Again, simplifying that process because it will probably split index.js into multiple files to keep them from being too big, and there'll be tree shaking and stuff like that. But we don't need to get into that in this case. The general sense is all of that React code is converted to JavaScript, plain JavaScript, and put into index.js.
Okay, this is totally making sense. I'm just gonna move stuff. So, okay, and then you said, let me move these notes to another page. Move down here. Cool, thank you. And then you said anything else you wanted to talk about after the SPA?
Yeah. So you now have the index.html file, you have your JavaScript files, you have your CSS files. So those get served to the client. So you get the client gets the index.html file. It says, hey, go get these JavaScript files, go get these CSS files and those images files. And all of that code is constantly executed on the client, right? So it's SPAs are client side. So everything is on that user's computer. This is one of the reasons that, for example, something like Prisma won't run in this part of your application because it's client side, and in order for Prisma to run, you would have to send every user the username, password, and access information to your database. And then someone who's being malicious could just read that and be like, oh, well, there's the username and password to access Jenn's database, and I can just go in there and delete her stuff or modify it. And now all of a sudden her front page shows pictures of Elon and cryptocurrency scams. And Jenn's like, oh no, that's not what I wanted to show the world. That sucks. So yeah, this is all on the client side.
And
So
again, client side means their
your
computer.
browser, specifically browser.
Okay, cool.
All right. So now JavaScript applications can also be server-side rendered. So server-side rendered means that when a request comes in for a particular page, the server will load the JavaScript for that page and render it on the server. So this is similar to WordPress, right? When you visit a page for WordPress, the web server renders that page and sends it to the user. So the same process is happening here. Obviously different language and whatnot, but the same general process. It is taking that route that you're asking for, so /blog /TJS TJT, and it says, hey, what JavaScript do I need to render this page? Okay, let's execute that JavaScript, create the index.html, or not the index, the blog /TJT file, and then send that to that complete HTML file to the user.
Okay. So, and hello, happy to see you. Okay, so I think where I'm a little stuck, and I honestly don't know if I've had this on the show, which is something that, of course, like we hear about client side or server side, or in my head, hydration goes into this.
We're about to talk to so server side rendering will have hydration. We're going to get there in a second. Okay, I wanted to make just waiting for you to kind of ask the questions about server side rendering. Yeah.
I guess what I don't get is when it's on the client side, does that mean local only?
What do you mean by local only?
Because you said it has to do with their browser. I guess where I'm having a hard time picturing is if it's on client side, like it's not going to load till it gets to their computer.
Correct.
And then it's going to load, where this server side is going to load before it even goes through.
Correct.
The interwebs.
Correct.
After interwebs, before interwebs.
Before, yep.
Okay. That is
so here's
a very simplified version of it.
It's super simplified, but so here's why this matters and why server-side rendering is often chosen for performance. So let's say that this SPA app needs to get information from a database, right? It needs to load blog posts, it needs to load user information, etc., right? Or whatever the case is, right? It needs to load information from a database. As we said, generally it won't access the database directly because of security issues. There are a few exceptions, like you can do like Firestore, but generally you don't access your database directly from the client side. So in this case, right, with the SPA, wait, why do you have oh, right, sorry, I see how you're writing it. It's confusing for a second. So in the case of the SPA, you go and visit, or like I go and visit Teach Gen Tech, right? Mm-hmm. It sends me the HTML, it sends me those JavaScript bundles, CSS bundles, initial images. My browser starts to render that JavaScript, and it says, oh, well, in order to display this page correctly, you need to go and get the 10 most recent blog posts. So now my browser says, okay, based on the JavaScript, I need to access the web server, the API that you're going to talk about tomorrow. So we don't want to go into this too much because you can ask all those API questions tomorrow.
Okay.
It'll access the API, which is will be your server side, right? So in this is where we talk about full stack development, right? So full stack development, you have front end development, which is building the pages. You have back end development, which is the server that interacts with the database or third party APIs. And then you have full stack that does both. So
as a side note, just because Alien, damn it, I will get it right one of these days. This is his theme.
oh, okay, yeah, that's right. He was the one who made that theme. Nice.
Yeah. Eventually he will be on the show. We will figure out schedules. But I just wanted to, showcase that because it's very exciting. I really
Awesome.
like this theme. Okay, please continue.
Right. So this SBA says, okay, well, I need to contact the API, the backend server, and get the 10 most recent blog posts. Oh, I also need to go and get, whatever, some, her 3 most recent projects. I need to get her last 5 tweets, whatever the case is, right? So it has to go and get this information. So now it has to send requests to your backend server for that information. Your backend server gets that request, processes the request, and sends that information back, usually in the form of like JSON. And then that client will read that JSON, take that information, so those 10 blog posts, and it will say, okay, here's the information you asked for, and it'll render your blog preview 10 times, one for each of the posts. So now if you're thinking about this in terms of like how does this affect performance, the user had to request the JavaScript first. It had to be sent to the user. Before the page could be rendered, another request had to be sent to the server to go and get this blog post information, to get these projects, right? And then so the client has to sit and wait, right? So the client's waiting while that process happens and that information returns.
Okay.
Then it can render that information and hopefully render the whole page. Hopefully there's nothing else it needs to do. So server-side rendering, what happens is, because you're rendering on the server immediately says, I need 10 blog posts. Now, in most cases, it's going to be faster for the server, in this case, like Vercel, to contact the database, which is going to be on another server, right? So you're learning MySQL, you might look at a database that's hosted on something like PlanetScale.
Yeah.
Right? So your database is on a different physical server than Vercel. It's on this PlanetScale server. It's almost for sure faster for Vercel to contact your database than the client. The Vercel's already on like enterprise level networking. PlanetScale's on enterprise level networking. The user's on like whatever networking they have, some DSL package or their phone or whatever, right? So, oh yeah, of course, it should actually not say PlanetScale because you're.
It's okay. I wasn't going to correct it.
But no, it's yep. You work for a company that provides that, so yes. Okay. What's the it's Evian?
Ivan.
Like why?
Like IVAN. Just
yeah. I would never guess Ivan looking at that from being a guy from Toronto, Canada. But anyway, Ivan.
Yeah. No.
So yes. So yeah.
It was a made up word. It's not something that means something in Finnish or anything.
Oh, okay.
And so yes.
But it probably makes more sense to pronounce it that way to Finnish people than me, I would guess, but maybe not.
I don't know.
Who knows?
I don't correct people when they say it. I'm just like, yeah, whatever. Because
if you didn't tell me that it was Ivan, I would Ivan would be like my 50th guess probably. But anyway.
Yeah, no, everyone is like that. That's why I don't even like Okay, so
So Vercel is going to be faster to contact Ivan's DB, get that data, and it's almost for sure going to be faster to render the page than the client's browser, right? That's not always
yeah.
true. Sometimes the user has a monster computer at home and they know what they're, they've got everything optimized and stuff like that. Like, look, my computer is ridiculous because I have it optimized for gaming, and I spent way too much money on it, but that's not the average person. And certainly, like, your phone isn't going to render faster than a server. So Vercel says, "Oh, I need these 10 blog posts." Hit up Ivan, get the 10 blog posts, render the page, and then send that rendered HTML file to the user. So what you haven't had is that extra back and forth, right? The user didn't contact Vercel, get some information, and then have to contact Vercel again, who then contacted Ivan, who then got the database information, who then sent it back, right? So there's a whole lot more back and forth with an SPA potentially. Whereas with server-side rendering, a lot of that initial back and forth is handled between servers before the page is rendered. So that can be a lot more performant.
I'm giving up on my squares, but
Well, what you want to do is that one that comes down to render page, you want to go back to you want to have that arrow go back to Vercel, and then an arrow from Vercel to say render page. But yeah, it's getting there.
What? Okay, that's where. Sorry, I didn't know where my. Okay, there we go. So it goes like this, and we'll go like these, and then it will send a different arrow. We're gonna do pink like this, back to Vercel, and we're gonna erase this, and then we will do a orange one that is here to here.
Yep, that's
Yay!
yep.
In a very ugly way of doing it. I will rewrite it later.
It's all good. The key here is you only have that one orange arrow from Vercel to the user.
Oh, okay.
Whereas with the
So
SPA, you would have Vercel to the user back to Vercel, Vercel to Ivan, Ivan to Vercel, Vercel back to the user.
I feel like it's starting to click, but now I really want to draw these out because these little images, for some reason, really help my head understand stuff.
Yep. When you draw that row, I'm just going to step away for about 45 seconds. I'll be right back.
Do it. And then we're going to see if I got it right. We'll find out. Let's see. And I feel like we can definitely draw some bigger squares. So we have the browser, let's say browser, and then it has to go to Vercel, which is the server, and then it has to ask for, we're going to say this is the order. We'll find out. Blog post. Because I want to see what that blog post is. It's a new blog post. And then we have to do Ivan Postgres database. And then it needs to go back to Vercel, I think.
Should be Vercel to Ivan, Ivan to blog post to Vercel.
So, but where does it put the request?
Well, so what's going to happen is you're going to have the browser go to Vercel,
Okay.
back to the browser. Oh, so I guess the blog post square, is that the request for the blog post or the content of the blog post?
No,
That's
it's the request.
Okay.
Okay.
So
request.
yeah, so it should be arrow from browser to Vercel, then arrow from Vercel to browser.
And to Ivan.
No, then arrow to the blog post request,
Yeah.
Or
Sure.
Vercel. I guess it depends how you want to map it out. I would go blog post request, then to Vercel, then to Ivan.
Oh, okay. Okay. Hold on. That makes sense. We're just going to move you down here. Welcome to your new home. And then you go to Vercel. We're just going to make a lot of boxes. And then we,
I would keep Vercel where it was. That's a good spot for it.
Okay. So we got Vercel.
Yep.
So to double check that, I know it goes from we request the blog post.
No.
And
So the
then,
initial one is browser to Vercel, and then Vercel back to the browser.
Okay. And then,
Yep.
oh, because it has to check it.
Yep.
And then we do.
So now when it's executing the JavaScript, it says, oh crap, I need 10 blog posts. So now you have that blog post request.
Yeah,
and then that goes to Vercel.
And then to Vercel.
And then Vercel says, okay, I need that information from Ivan.
And then we go to Ivan.
And then
back to Vercel.
Back to Vercel. And Ivan says, here's the information. And then Vercel sends it back to the browser. I guess you could send it through the blog post request if you wanted to, but yeah.
That's not complicated at all.
Not at all. And remember that process occurs for every piece of data you need from your database, which on a more complicated site could be many pieces. Yeah, we're about to do SSG. We're just going to clarify SSR first, and then we'll go to SSG.
I'm okay. Let me put that. This is spa. Mm-hmm. This is and this would just be called SSR, right?
Yep.
SSR. Give myself a nice thing. Okay, there we go. I'm slowly picking up what you're putting down.
Yep. So we can see that SSR has the potential to be a lot faster. One, because there's less back and forth, and the back and forth that occurs is at the very start of the process and between servers. So you can end up being able to render the page a lot quicker, and certainly with less network requests, especially between the user and Vercel. So the last part of Vercel before we move to SSG is hydration. So hydration is essentially like so the first part of SSR sends an HTML page to the user, right? There's no JavaScript yet.
Right.
So hydration is essentially then taking and saying, okay, we've served a static HTML page, but we need to add that Astro or that React or that Solid.js code. So it comes in a step later. So the HTML page gets rendered on the user's browser, and they're like, oh, cool, here's the content. They start to scroll through it, and then what's happening, and the next step in the background, is the server and the browser are grabbing that JavaScript and it basically attaching it to the HTML, so that all of the interactivity that you would want from React or whatever the case is now present. So you might have interactivity on like a button. It gets attached as that React code comes in.
Okay. Okay. Give me a second, because I'm also like just trying to understand where we're at right now. Because, okay, so we have before the user browser, all of this happens. So it goes Vercel. yes, I'm rewriting the other one that we already have to 10 blog posts, or I'm just going to say blog post request. Yeah. Let's see if I can actually write. And then it goes to Ivan, the database, and then back to Vercel, and then it would render the page and be in the browser. Okay. So let me draw my arrows. Browser. Goodness gracious. So we're going to have some hot pink. It's going to be great. We go like this. And then we go like this. And then we're going to have a different color that will go all the way back to Vercel. And we will do green. Sure, why not? Then you render, and then you go to the browser. Thank you for holding. That was a lot. And now when we're talking about hydration, hydration will add it to like after the database part, or would it be like
After the browser.
after the browser?
Yep.
Okay.
So the user, in this case, the user's now received an HTML file, and it has all the blog posts and all the content, right? It's a complete page.
So I'm just going to say browser HTML then. And then after that is, then all of this will be added with, like, you said JavaScript and CSS?
No, it's all the JavaScript. CSS has already been sent, images, all that, and the HTML.
So I know this is extra, but HTML, CSS, images, already sent. So the JavaScript is now going to, it's going to go out to the JavaScript and then go back to the browser?
Sort of, yeah. It's kind of happening in the background. So, and that's the important thing to understand is like when you're looking at a server-side rendered page, the user's getting an HTML page and it pops up quickly and they're like, oh, cool. And then, in the background, as a follow-up step, hydration occurs, and that's Vercel or the host finishing the request and sending the JavaScript, and the JavaScript attaching itself to the HTML page. Because essentially React, like in a production environment, has a bunch of event listeners attached to the page, and those event listeners point to different pieces of JavaScript. So at this point, it's rendering that, like executing that JavaScript and attaching those event listeners and making the page interactive in the way that you would expect for React or whatever it is.
Okay, we said that the SPA is probably like a Next.js, so server side would be like React.
Nope, Next.js does all three. That's one of the reasons I'm using this example. The default behavior for Next.js is SPA. You have to choose to do SSR or SPA in Next. And like React, like if you use React with no framework, no Next, no Remix, no Astro, etc., if you use just like vanilla React, it is an SPA.
What's Vite?
Vite is an SPA. There is some server side rendering. I don't know if there's any SGA or SSG with Vite offhand.
I asked because one of the first ones that I did with Anthony Campolo was Vite's a build system, because we did a React app with Vite and Vercel.
Yep. Generally speaking, most people will treat Vite as a build system, which is build your React app, and then it will build the JavaScript bundles, the CSS bundles, etc. It's very fast and very efficient at doing it.
Okay. We're going to ask about build systems later. Let me go put that on my systems. That's not how you say like. It helps if I can eat. Okay, so cool. I feel like I'm getting it. All right, and then we have SSG after this.
Yep.
Okay. I honestly had no idea any of these really existed. Like, that they officially existed. I've heard of them, but didn't know what they meant. I'm so excited. So much drawing today. All right, so let's get some SSG. Server-side gathering.
Generated.
Oh,
That's
gathering.
not server side. It's static site generation.
Oh, okay. So is stuff like website builder or Wix and that kind of stuff, is that SSG?
Sorry, Wix or what?
Like GoDaddy's website builder, Wix, Squarespace, that kind of stuff?
No, I don't think any. I don't know actually specifically how they work under the hood. I don't really look at any of them. I think the answer is probably no for all of them. They're probably more server side rendered.
And Rex just said no as well. So thank you, Rex. Okay, so you're saying that they are probably SSRs?
Yep.
Okay.
That's my guess. Like especially with GoDaddy, I really know nothing about GoDaddy's site builder. And Wix and Squarespace, I'm pretty sure that by default they're SSR, but they might have some form of SSG. I'm not sure offhand.
That's why we will put probs.
Yeah.
SSR. We're not gonna.
Also probably doesn't matter because you probably have no choice with them. So like if you use them,
it's more for me to understand,
right?
Not
sure.
not to try to fix stuff. Just understand. Okay, so static site like Astro.
Astro is an example, and then Next allows you to do static site generation. So static site generation is this idea that your site has information that you're loading from a database or third-party APIs, but that information doesn't change very often. So your great example is like your or my personal sites. We don't update our projects or our blog posts all that often. I certainly don't.
I should be.
Well, we probably should be, but most people don't. So
okay.
And I mean, even in the general sense, even if you write a blog post a week, that's still really infrequent for this stuff. So your site isn't changing. Certainly, every hour, every day, you don't need to go and have your users querying your database to get updated information because you aren't writing blog posts every hour. Contrast this to a similar idea like a news site, which is essentially like very similar to a blog site in kind of a general sense. It's a whole bunch of stories, posts, but a news site is going to be adding new sites every few minutes potentially, or more frequently, depending on how big the site is, and they're going to be editing past stories, so their content is going to be a lot more dynamic than your personal site. So blog, your personal site, portfolios, blog sites are good examples of sites that can be relatively static. Doc sites, the docs for Astro, for Next, etc., tend to be relatively static as well. Stuff like that. So the idea with static site generation is when you do your build step, all of the pages that you want to statically generate are created then. So the interesting thing with Next is you can choose on a page by page basis which are SPA, which are SSR, which are SSG. So you could have 3 different pages in your next project, and you could choose a different behavior for each one if you want to. So in the case of my portfolio site, most of my portfolio site is statically generated. All my blog posts, my projects, the index page, etc. The one page that it isn't is I have a page that shows Spotify information, what I've been listening to, what I'm currently listening to if I'm listening to something, popular albums. That page is handled as an SPA because it wants to get updated information. So when you're setting up Next and you have a bunch of pages that you want to be statically generated, you set them up to be statically generated, and when that build step occurs, that's when they're created. So this happens well before the user would request the page.
Side note, that does not go to this page, but it's going to help, especially with the conference I have going on. Is Next a meta framework?
Yeah, I think
Because Next is to React as Next is to Vue.
I honestly, the whole framework, meta framework, meta framework stuff people chat about, it's like, I don't know. Next is definitely a framework. I don't know if it. Yeah, I think it does, because I think it goes beyond just React. I think meta frameworks are stuff that include routing and whatnot. But yeah, Next does a ton of stuff, and it's getting even more complicated too in the future.
That's okay. I wrote my note to go look into it later. Okay. So I like that I wrote down that it can be mattering on the page. It can be all of those. Ooh, excuse you. I don't want this. Done. Goodbye. So something that I just realized that I don't think I understand from these graphics is what is considered the build step.
That's that npm run build. So we talked about how Vercel, when you're deploying, will grab a copy of your repo, typically the main branch.
Right.
It'll do the npm install. It's right there at the top of your page, by the way, if you didn't see it.
Yeah. I guess, where do I go from I forget I can do this. Where does this go in this?
After Edge Network.
This is after Edge Network. Okay.
Yep. Same with SSR.
And SSG?
SSG is actually split into 2 parts. So there is during the build step, there is create the static pages. So create HTML versions of the pages. And then those get put on the Edge network. So the comparison is, if you do Next as an SPA, you'll end up with one HTML file, that index.html file, your JavaScript files, your CSS files, and those will go onto the Edge network and get served to the users. In the case of SSG, you could have dozens of HTML files for all the pages that you marked to be statically generated. And then, you may still have some other, like you still may have you'll obviously still have your index.html file. You may have some pages that are handled outside of SSG, like I said, because you can do it page by page. So those will be handled by that index.html file and your JavaScript, whereas the ones that were statically generated, like blog.html or contact.html, those will be served as HTML to the user from the Edge network.
And then that's as far as I got on what you just said.
Yeah. So what I would do is copy the whole Vercel to Edge network part and bring it down to your SSG section.
Okay. Copy. Paste.
All right. And get rid of that arrow. Okay. So you want like an arrow down from that npm build, and that's where you will say render, render pages as HTML files or something to that effect.
Okay.
And then off of the Edge network, you now have serve rendered pages plus JavaScript plus CSS plus images.
So because it does this first or during the build, it renders the pages as HTML files. The next step goes to the Edge network, and then it does the SSR stuff.
Nope, no, it doesn't need to do SSR. The HTML files already exist with SSG. It's pre-created them.
Okay. So then it goes the Edge network then to somebody's browser.
Yeah, so it's gonna, the Edge network is now gonna serve those HTML files directly. Doesn't have to render them, it can just simply serve them or send them to the user.
Users browser. So SSG is almost like less complicated than what's going on up here.
Right. That part on SSG where it says render pages as HTML files, that'll do the whole contact Ivan, contact third-party APIs, etc., and get the data.
Where would we put like the browser request, like the blog request?
You wouldn't. So what happens is when you're setting up SSG in Next and
it automatically does it.
Well,
it never changes.
Well, yeah, you set up, so in Next you add extra functions to your route components. So like SSRs get static, get server side props, and I feel like they changed the SSG one since I last looked, but it used to be get static props, but I feel like they changed it. So let me just double check. Actually, I'm not going to worry about it. It doesn't really matter. You add these functions, and those are server-side functions, which by existing, they say, oh, there's get server-side props. That's going to server-side render the page. Oh, there's the function for SSG. That's going to statically generate the page. And in those functions, you handle, your request to get your data, right? So in that function, you would write your code to connect your database and query for your 10 blog posts, and then you return that queried data from that function, and then that data gets brought in as a prop to your actual page, and then it can use it to render it.
I'm going to say okay. Because like what you're saying does make sense. At the same time, this last part is not clicking, but we've gone through a lot.
Yeah, it's super important to understand that last part though. Like, so essentially you have like an extra function on your, so next you do, it's kind of like Astro. You have a TSX or JSX or whatever file for each route, right? So let's say you have your blog index one, so you have a blog.tsx file, and so you write your component, which is how it's going to be displayed, how you're going to create a grid of those posts or a list of those posts or whatever. But then separate from that, you have a function that says, hey, we're going to render this as a static page. In order to do that, I need to provide these 10 blog posts as data for that process. So let's connect to the database, get those 10 blog posts, and have that data available to the rendering process. So then when you do npm run build, during that build process, so literally during that build process, that code will get executed. During the build process, you'll connect to the database and get those 10 blog posts. And you'll get that data.
Okay. I think I just need more room to, and then I can put what I think you're saying. So when it's doing the build and we'll render pages as HTML, this is when it is going through and going to PG admin or PG database, any APIs. Oh, go away. Thank you. And apparently, what are you doing? Thank you. JavaScript, all of that, images.
No, well,
Not images.
I mean, it's not necessarily the images. It'll know the images will be there. There's nothing. It doesn't really do anything with the images.
Okay.
Like it'll just render the HTML that says, "Hey, get this image." But yeah, as it renders those pages, it'll connect to your database as needed and query the information, or a third-party API, like you're connecting to get the weather information on a given day or something like that, whatever it is. It'll make those queries, get that information, and use that information when it creates those HTML pages. In fact, let's use the weather example. This will probably help to make it make sense, right? So let's say you work on your website today, and you decide that you want to display the weather, right? So you write some code to go and get the current weather for your hometown, right, and display that. But then you decide to statically generate the page. So then what happens is when you take your code, you're done, you're like, that looks good, you commit it to your repo, you push it up to GitHub. Vercel says, oh, new changes, grabs a new copy of your repo from GitHub, does the npm install, npm build. During the build process, it says, oh, I'm statically generating these pages. So it creates those pages. During that process, it connects to the weather API and gets the weather for today, right, when it does it. So you're like, what's your weather? You're Fahrenheit, so it's like, I don't know, whatever, 50 degrees or something like that. Sunny and 50 degrees where you're at today. So it statically generates these pages and it shows that weather at the time that it does that build step. Now, let's say I visit your page on Wednesday and it has gotten really cold and snowy and cloudy. Because the page was statically generated, I will at least initially see sunny and 50 degrees. Hydration, when that JavaScript gets attached after initial load, will probably update that depending on how you've built the page, but it should update that. And then it should flip to it should re-query the API live and get the new information. But it should, initially at least, the statically generated page will have today's weather. Does that make sense?
I think so. You might end up with that. Whatever. Copy. And paste. I think I'm there. Pretty sure. I need all of this to be out of my way. Sure. Works. You can go there. As then. So when something is GitHub new commit, it goes to Vercel. Vercel says, okay, let me grab all the content. We'll make sure it's good because it updates all content. And then it's like, cool, let's do npm install, npm run build. And we're going to check the database and APIs if there's any new content. If there is, then we'll put it onto the static page. If there's
so to be correct, it doesn't check for new content. It just gets the current copy of the content. It doesn't care whether it's new or not. It just says you want the 10 most recent blog posts. It doesn't. It'll still do the page, the rendering, and the data request, whether the current build already had that, because it's building a fresh copy. It has no idea what was built 7 days ago, right?
Okay. And
it doesn't know that you have the same blog post as 7 days ago and all you did is change your contact page today. It's a whole new build, and it just assumes that it needs all the information.
And that is, we'll copy the current page, and then it'll put it to the user's browser as a.
Nope. So now it's, you have all of this stuff rendered. It puts it on the edge network, pre-rendered.
Pre-rendered.
Yep. So all the HTML pages are already created. So now when the user visits one of your pages, the edge network that's hosting the page says, oh, you want the contact page? There you go. Or you want the blog index page? There you go. It doesn't, the edge network and Vercel don't need to server-side render it. It's already been statically generated. So it just sends that blog index, that HTML file with the blog index, straight to the user.
Okay. And then if there is like an API or something like the weather, it's the hydration that's going to update the static page.
Should, yeah. Depending on how you set up the page, but it should update the page. Yes.
Okay. So I get part one of like, shared hosting and all of that. And then I get part two of like what we were saying that Vercel does with the SPA and SSR and SSG. But what does shared hosting do with like the VPS or managed WordPress, or are those all just like, how often do they get updated, or are they all just?
So most of those, so again, you have to remember that when you start talking about WordPress, it has nothing to do with the hosting. It has to do instead with what the project is. So if I put, if I want to statically generate a React website using Next, and then deploy that onto a VPS, I could do that.
Okay.
And then it would only get updated when I deploy it again. Right?
Okay.
So it depends. Right? So this whole SPA, SSR, SSG, that's not specifically Next. Next is doing that, but that's not specifically Next. That can happen when you deploy your React application or whatever, your JavaScript application, your Astro application to other types of services as well, right? So you could 100% take your Astro application, build your website, right? And you're like, okay, it's working perfectly. You do the Astro build command, which is probably npm run build, but I'd have to double check that off the top of my head. Actually, I'm pretty sure it's npm run build because it's on Vite. And then Astra will build a static. Yeah, I thought so. As soon as I remembered it's Vite, I was like, yeah, thank you though for confirming. Astra will build static pages and bundle your JavaScript and your CSS. And you could then take that build and actually deploy it on GoDaddy via FTP on a shared hosting account.
But then when you make a new commit, it's not going to update.
It's not going to update nearly as much. So you would have to do the build locally again, and you would have to FTP it, which is yes, exactly. That's not fun at all, is it? It's much nicer to have Vercel just do it automatically. So all of these more modern tooling that we or hosts that we use, Vercel, Netlify, Railway, Render, etc., they almost all have a step where they handle grabbing that information from GitHub and deploying it. There are ways to so no, there are ways to integrate Git into other hosting and stuff like that. But usually it's not as smooth or as painless, especially the setup process.
Thanks.
Or at
I
least it
was
wasn't
writing
when
it
I
as,
used it.
yeah,
It's been a few
I was
years.
writing it as a note, not, but I like
No,
that
no, but I
it worked.
mean, yeah. The answer is like you know, if you looked at GoDaddy now, there's probably a way to have an interface with a GitHub account. I don't know how well that works. I haven't touched Git on, you know, GoDaddy or you know shared hosting. I haven't tried to do that kind of stuff for a few years now, so I don't know what the modern tooling looks like. When I tried it before, usually the setup was annoying at and kind of getting everything working.
So do things like Vercel charge based on usage then or room?
Usage. Yeah. So it's they actually keep copies of like every deployment you've ever made, I believe, or at least a lot of them. I've never bothered to check how far back it goes, but it certainly goes a long way back. But their pricing, if you go to, like if you look at it, you get you're paying for bandwidth, you're paying for team members who can use it, and you're paying for their serverless function requests and execution, which is something else to talk about. But you
Yeah,
know,
I'm like I feel like I am tapped out on the knowledge side.
yeah.
We went through a ton and I loved it and there's so much going on right now.
So the one last thing I
Uh
want to add is we've mentioned this whole edge network. So edge network is essentially the easiest way to think about it is like a CDN for Vercel. So you're taking, unlike you know GoDaddy's shared hosting, which is in one physical location, with Vercel or Netlify, you're automatically deploying your files to places all over the world to quote unquote the edge of the network near the user. Is what that kind of is trying to go like hint at, so that
okay.
Vercel, you know, all of that stuff, that CDN stuff, etc., is all taken care of for you. The same way they automatically take care of a free SSL cert. You don't have to worry about that or pay for that. That stuff's all taken care of for you. So if you're deploying to Vercel, you're automatically deploying to a CDN. And your users are automatically going to have a CDN node that is close or relatively close to them, so that the performance will be good. And then when you deploy again, it will update all of those CDN nodes, so your website is you know updated across the edge network.
Okay. Like it does make sense, but I'm too mushy brained right now to
Yeah, no,
like,
we've gone over a lot, so
but it's so helpful because without revisiting what I was previously taught, like it wouldn't have connected as well. So I really, really appreciate that. I will be uploading all my lovely notes in a more legible way later. And these are the type of things I'm excited about getting up and running on my website, because when I have photos like these, it's going to be easier just to make sure they're linked and that people can read them when they need to than just images. But it's kind of a mess and a half. We'll work through that process eventually. So much knowledge. The squares, it's definitely the squares that help understanding what's going
Yeah,
on.
for sure.
And it also makes sense where what hydration does a lot better than I've ever understood it before.
I remember
And
when I was learning React, I would hear people talk about hydration, and like I was like, what is hydration? And then when I finally was like, oh, I should go understand it, I was like, oh, that's so simple to understand. Why didn't I Google it like 5 months ago? But it's a key thing.
it also, I feel like, doesn't always make sense. At least for me, this was really helpful seeing the little graphics to go with it, because I could understand the process. Where if it's in text format, I'm just like, you're telling me something, but I don't have little boxes or visuals that
Yeah,
show me what it is.
everyone learns differently for sure.
I
Um,
know.
and yeah, like the other thing too is like a lot of courses that'll teach React or whatever, they don't teach this stuff because it's not part of the language or the framework, and
Hmm.
it's boring, right? Um, a lot of courses, like I see a lot of people that come out of school or come out of like courses and they have no idea how to like deploy stuff or handle deployment errors and stuff like that. They're like, oh, I just did npm run dev and that's all I ever had to do in my boot camp. Like, how do I make it go live? And there's just
I
not all great information on that.
I am laughing because you're like, yeah, it's boring and stuff, and I'm like, I just found this all so fascinating. But
Well,
I'm
it's
also
boring
that
if you're
person that
sorry, I should qualify. It's boring if you were sitting down to learn React. You're like, why am I learning about hosting, right? Like, I want to learn about React. Make things go burr on the screen. Don't talk about hosting to me.
that is fair.
Yeah.
That is fair. And thank you everyone for joining today. Like, we got a really dope raid. We've had people stay and hang out, and yeah, I stream very, very like 1 to 4 times a week, somewhere around this time frame. Yet next week and the week after, I am out of town. I am going to Portugal and Munich and hosting Forge Nation for View Nation through View School. So it's an online conference. You can see me there if you want to come hang out that week. But we still have a few more streams this week. And yeah, now to go through all this, is there anything we missed that you wanted to make sure we tackled today?
I mean, this is just a lot of kind of high level stuff. Like I said, we're simplifying a lot of it. This is all of this stuff is exceptionally detailed. So
Hmm.
I think really the key is like go through it, figure out what questions you still have, and maybe we can do a follow up stream or at least a follow up talk and go over them. I guess the only
Yay!
other minor thing I would add, just for anyone who's listening, and I think you kind of asked about it earlier, is like pricing. Is like, why does GoDaddy charge for everything versus, why do you get to get stuff free from Vercel? The answer with all of these tools like Vercel, Netlify, Ivan just launched their free tier, Planet Scale, Railway, etc. They all have a free tier because there's a whole bunch of developers that are building projects and learning stuff. And if they can use these tools for free and get used to how good Railway is or how good Vercel is, then they'll advocate to use those when they join companies. Or if their side project becomes successful, they'll move from a free tier to a paid tier, etc. So and realistically, a lot of the stuff that gets hosted on the free tiers isn't very active and isn't using a lot of resources. Uh, Typically, some people try to scam the system. So Railway has they have like a free tier and you can deploy like a Node app or whatever you want, including a database. And they recently had to change how they like some of the terms on their free tier because people were getting I don't know the exact details, but people were getting around the database limitations on the free tier by recreating their database every hour. so they didn't have to pay. So they
Yeah.
the free tier with Railway now means you can only create 5 databases a month, so that people can't do that. But most people just are not that active, or I shouldn't say that, not people, their projects aren't that active, so you don't have to pay a lot to house all these projects. But what you do is make friends and fans with the developers, who
Mhm.
will hopefully all turn into, not all, but many will turn into paying customers down the road, and that's how they make their money.
And adding to that, I think a big reason why other like it's been considered like old school hosting or shared hosting has a cost is it's a lot of it is done for you. Like for cPanel, they automatically set it up to connect to your database. So you don't have to manually do that stuff. At least that's my envisioning of why they would have it, but it
Part of that, but
definitely.
part of that too, if you think about GoDaddy, is that if I knew nothing about websites, I don't know, I own a bakery store, and I'm like, I want to do my own website. I Google and I'm like, how to have my own website, and like the first result is GoDaddy, like, create your own
Mhm.
website without having to learn any programming for $4.99 a month. So I click on that, and all of a sudden I end up with a WordPress website. I haven't had to learn programming. I haven't had to understand hosting. I haven't had
That's
to upload
true.
anything. I just now have a WordPress website, and I'm like, oh, okay, cool, and like figure it out from there, hopefully, or hopefully not, or however GoDaddy wants to do it, because they probably want to flip you on other services. Um, but yeah, that's kind of how it's like a different environment. Like with React, um, yeah, 100%.
100%.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like there's lots of people who run WordPress sites super successfully. It's not there's no knock on that. It's just a different approach. No one, like, there's no situation where you're like, hey, I know nothing about websites and I want to deploy it, and then you end up with a React website that works. Not reasonably. Like, it just doesn't, you don't hit up a host, and Vercel's not like, oh, here's your React website, and now you can
Yeah.
just go configure it. Like that, it does. It's two very different sides of web
Hmm.
development. Um, and one of the things with WordPress is that you can literally build an entire WordPress website with ecom and like all sorts of stuff. Like, you can do like a like a learning site with courses. You can do all of this stuff and never write a line of code, because all of the tools are there, whether it's themes, plugins, WordPress itself, which is great for a lot of people and a lot of businesses, but also
Yeah.
not great for other people. So that's why we have all these different options. I hate it
Yeah.
personally, but that's me. Like, I
I
just don't
know
want
how
to.
to I know how to troubleshoot WordPress. I know how to help people once a WordPress site is developed. Not awesome at building it from scratch. Ever. Never successfully done that.
Yeah.
And that's really funny to me, especially being part of WordCamp. And yes, so everyone go follow Roy on Twitter. So you have somewhere that you can go bug him to come back on the show. And also make sure that you subscribe on YouTube and follow. And if you feel so willing, subscribe here as well. And I will link YouTube. And I need to go find your Twitter. And then
Roy Anger.
oh,
Super
that's
easy.
easy. That is easy. But I'm still gonna go grab it to link it. And then last but not least, y'all, I'm gonna raid you over to Chris Griffin because I know that he's always doing some fun content over there. And thank you everyone for joining. And hit me up on Twitter or on YouTube if you have questions, you want to see us go into a specific direction. And yeah, see you later, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Bye.